The invitation. The golden hues of the evening sun painted the sky as Nathaniel Matebreed stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his Manhattan penthouse, gazing at the sprawling cityscape below. He swirled a glass of finely aged whiskey in his hand, the amber liquid catching the light like molten gold. The skyline reflected his journey, a climb from the depths of poverty to the pinnacle of success. To the world, he was a tech billionaire, a philanthropist, and a man of immense influence. But tonight, something far less tangible occupied his thoughts. An ornate invitation lay open on the marble counter behind him, its cursive script announcing the details of his upcoming wedding to Genevieve Astor, a woman whose beauty and lineage carried the weight of old money and impeccable connections. Their union was more than love. It was a merger of empires. The event promised to be the social spectacle of the decade, hosted at Nate's private island resort. Every aspect had been curated to perfection. From the imported French roses lining the venue to the Michelin-starred chefs preparing a menu fit for royalty. Yet, one invitation held a different purpose. It had been sent not out of courtesy or obligation, but with a deliberate intention. To Emily Carter, a woman Nate had not seen in 6 years. The decision to include her had been impulsive at first, sparked by the distant memory of her laughter, the way she had believed in him before anyone else did. But it was anger that solidified the choice. She had left him in his darkest hour, just as his dreams were on the brink of collapse. The thought of her walking into his world now, seeing the heights he had scaled without her, filled him with a vindictive satisfaction. He envisioned her stepping onto the island, her face a mixture of regret and awe, as she realized what she had given up. Nate had everything she once doubted he could achieve, and this wedding would be the ultimate vindication. "Mr. Reed," his assistant Victoria interrupted, her voice smooth and professional. She had the uncanny ability to read his moods without a word. "The final guest list has been confirmed. Everyone RSVP'd as expected." Nate turned, setting the glass down. "And Emily?" "She accepted the invitation," Victoria replied, hesitating for a moment. "However, there's an unexpected detail." Nate raised an eyebrow. "What kind of detail?" "She's bringing guests," Victoria said carefully. "2 young boys. Twins." For a moment, Nate's polished exterior cracked, his expression hardening. "Twins," he repeated, his voice colder. Victoria nodded. "Yes, sir. About 5 or 6 years old." Nate's stomach tightened. The timeline made his chest constrict with a mix of anger and confusion. The resemblance was undeniable, according to the preliminary information Victoria had gathered. His mind raced. Could they be? No, she wouldn't have kept something like that from him. Would she? "Find out everything about her life since she left New York," he ordered. "Who she's been with, where she's lived, and how she's supported herself. I want every detail by tomorrow morning." "Understood," Victoria said, retreating with the quiet efficiency he valued. As she disappeared into the corridor, Nate remained rooted in place, the city lights glittering behind him. For years, he had buried the pain of Emily's departure beneath the weight of his ambitions. But now, the fortress he had built seemed to quake under the revelation she had brought to his doorstep. The night before the wedding, the island was alive with activity. Guests arrived in private jets and yachts, their laughter and clinking glasses filling the air as they marveled at the opulence of Nate's creation. But amidst the grandeur, a shadow lingered over Nate's thoughts. In his suite, he paced restlessly, his tailored suit feeling suffocating. The more he thought about the twins, the more his emotions wavered between anger, suspicion, and something he didn't want to name: hope. Victoria's knock brought him back to reality. She entered, holding a tablet loaded with the information he had requested. "Emily Carter," she began, her tone measured. "She's been living in a small town upstate for the past 6 years. No steady employment records. She's raising the twins alone. Their names are Owen and Caleb." Nate felt his pulse quicken at the names. Victoria continued, The boys are enrolled in a private school. Tuition is substantial. Someone's been supporting her financially through anonymous bank transfers. The payments started 6 years ago. Nate's brow furrowed. 6 years ago. Who's been funding her? We're still investigating the source, Victoria replied. But I have one more detail. She hesitated, her usually steady demeanor faltering. The boys. They look like you, Nate. It's uncanny. The air seemed to leave the room. Nate's mind reeled. Emily, the twins, the possibility that he had been kept in the dark about something so monumental, it all spiraled in his thoughts. That's enough, he said, dismissing Victoria. He needed to think. Alone, he sat at the edge of his bed, his head in his hands. The past he thought he had buried was back, demanding answers. And as much as he wanted to cling to anger, a part of him, a part he barely recognized, longed to know the truth. The morning of the wedding dawned with a golden brilliance, the island aglow in the early light. Nate stood on the balcony, the weight of the day pressing heavily on him. Below, the preparations were in full swing, staff bustling about to ensure every detail was flawless. But perfection seemed impossible now. When he had decided to send that invitation, he had envisioned triumph, an undeniable display of his success. Instead, he was left grappling with the possibility that the life he had built was more fragile than he thought. The knock on his door came as no surprise. It was Victoria again, her expression unreadable. "She's here," she said simply. Nate nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then it's time we talked." Emily's arrival at the resort was as understated as the woman herself. She wore a simple sundress, her dark hair pulled back, her posture radiating quiet strength. Beside her, the twins walked hand in hand, their bright eyes taking in the grandeur with childlike wonder. Nate approached her in the lobby, his steps measured but his heart racing. For a moment, their eyes met, and the years fell away. He saw the woman he had loved, the woman who had believed in him when no one else did. But he also saw the pain of their past reflected in her gaze. "Emily," he greeted, his voice strained. "Nate," she replied, her tone neutral but firm. His eyes drifted to the boys. They stared back at him with curiosity, their resemblance to him undeniable. He felt a lump rise in his throat but forced it down. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. Emily nodded. "Yes, we do." And as they walked toward the villa Nate had arranged for her, the tension between them was palpable. For the first time in years, Nate Reed felt unprepared for what lay ahead. The unexpected guests. The morning air on the island was crisp and salty, the waves lapping gently against the golden shoreline. Guests milled about, sipping mimosas and admiring the carefully cultivated luxury that surrounded them. Every inch of the resort was a testament to Nathaniel Reed's success, a triumph of ambition, vision, and sheer will. But amidst the grandeur, Nate stood frozen in the main lobby, staring at Emily Carter and the two boys who looked like echoes of his past. The boys clung to her hands, their eyes wide with curiosity. They were impossibly alike, with dark hair and striking green eyes that mirrored Nate's own. Their energy filled the room as they whispered to each other, tugging on Emily's hands to pull her toward the nearby lobby fountain. Nate's voice broke through the haze. "Emily," he said, his tone sharp and low. "We need to talk. Now." Emily's gaze remained steady, though her grip on the boy's hands tightened. "Not in front of them," she said, her voice calm but firm. His eyes flicked to the children, and for a moment, the world around him tilted. They were his. There was no denying it. But how? Why hadn't he known? The questions buzzed in his mind like static as he gestured toward a private hallway leading to one of the smaller lounges. "This way," he said curtly. Emily knelt and spoke softly to the twins, her tone gentle but resolute. "Owen, Caleb, I need you to wait here for just a little while. I'll be back soon. Okay?" The boys looked unsure but nodded, their small faces scrunched in curiosity as they watched their mother follow the tall, imposing man into the private lounge. The door closed with a soft click, muffling the chatter and clinking glasses of the guests outside. The lounge was an intimate space, filled with plush furniture and the faint scent of fresh orchids. Nate turned to face Emily, his expression a storm of emotions. Anger, confusion, and something he couldn't quite name. 6 years, Emily, he began, his voice low but filled with restrained fury. 6 years, and I'm just finding out I have children. You didn't think I deserved to know. Emily crossed her arms, her posture unyielding. Deserved to know. You made it perfectly clear that your career was all that mattered, Nate. I reached out to you. I called. I sent letters. You never answered. That's not true, he shot back. I never received anything. You can't just disappear with. You weren't listening. She interrupted, her voice rising for the first time. I stood in front of your secretary for hours, trying to get you to see me. But you were too busy making deals and building your empire to notice. You shut me out. Nate stared at her, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy fog. He remembered those days. The long hours, the sleepless nights, the tunnel vision that came with clawing his way to the top. Had he really been so consumed that he missed the signs? That doesn't excuse this, he said, his tone softening but still firm. They're my sons, Emily. I had a right to know. Emily's shoulders sagged slightly, the fire in her eyes dimming. And what would you have done, Nate? Dragged me through a legal battle. Claimed custody out of spite. I had no idea what kind of father you'd be, if you even wanted to be one. You were a stranger to me by the time I left. Her words stung, but Nate couldn't deny the truth in them. He had been a different man back then, driven, ruthless, and singularly focused on his goals. But now, faced with the reality of his children, he couldn't ignore the ache in his chest. What do you want, Emily? He asked, his voice quieter. Why did you bring them here? I didn't come here to cause trouble, she replied, her gaze steady. They deserve to know who their father is. And you deserve the chance to know them. But if you think for a second that I'll let you waltz in and take over their lives, you're wrong. Nate took a step closer, his eyes searching hers. I don't want to take over their lives. I need to know them. I need to be their father. Emily studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she sighed and nodded. Then prove it. Show me that you're more than the man who sent that invitation just to gloat. Show me you're capable of putting them first. Her challenge hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Nate nodded, his jaw tightening with determination. He didn't know how, but he was going to prove himself, not just to Emily, but to the boys who were waiting for her outside. When Nate and Emily returned to the lobby, the twins were sitting on the edge of the fountain, their feet kicking idly as they watched the water ripple and shimmer. At the sight of their mother, they jumped up and ran to her, their excitement bubbling over. Mom. Look, Owen said, holding up a smooth stone he had found in the water. It's shiny. Caleb tugged on her arm. Can we go to the beach now? Please. Emily smiled softly and knelt to their level. In a little while, okay. First, there's someone I want you to talk to. The twins looked up at Nate, their curiosity returning. For a moment, he felt his throat tighten, unsure of how to bridge the gap between them. But then Owen stepped forward, his head tilted inquisitively. Are you the guy who built all this? He asked, his small hand gesturing to the towering ceilings and gleaming floors. Nate smiled despite himself. Yeah, I am. That's cool, Owen said, his eyes wide. Do you build other stuff too? Nate crouched down to their level, the tension in his chest easing slightly. I've built a lot of things. Houses, offices, even parks. Can you build sandcastles? Caleb asked, his voice shy but hopeful. Nate chuckled, the sound foreign to his ears. I think I can manage that. Emily watched the exchange with a mix of apprehension and quiet relief. For the first time, she saw a flicker of the man she had once loved, the man who had dreamed of building a life with her before ambition consumed him. "Go on," she said softly, giving Nate a small nod. "Take them to the beach. I'll join you later." Nate hesitated, his gaze meeting hers. There was no malice, no anger, just a cautious trust that felt fragile and precious. He nodded and held out his hands to the twins. "Come on, let's see if we can build the biggest sandcastle this island has ever seen," he said, his voice lighter than it had been in years. Owen and Caleb took his hands without hesitation, their laughter ringing out as they led him toward the beach. Emily watched them go, her heart a complicated knot of hope and fear. She had taken a risk bringing them here, but for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that it might pay off. As Nate walked with his sons toward the golden sands, he felt something shift deep within him. For years, he had measured his success in skyscrapers and bank accounts. But now, as he listened to the boys chatter excitedly about their plans for the sandcastle, he realized that this moment, simple and unassuming, was worth more than all of it. Building bridges in the sand, the golden rays of the afternoon sun cast long shadows over the island's pristine beach. The tide whispered softly as it ebbed and flowed, leaving delicate patterns in the sand. Nate knelt next to Owen and Caleb, the twins armed with small plastic shovels and buckets, their faces alight with excitement. "This has to be the tallest sandcastle ever," Owen declared, digging furiously at the base of the structure they were building. "And it needs a moat," Caleb chimed in, his brow furrowed in concentration as he traced a shallow trench around the mound of sand they'd piled together. Nate couldn't help but smile at their enthusiasm. He rolled up his sleeves and dug in alongside them, his hands coated with damp sand, as he helped shape the castle walls. It had been years since he'd done something so unstructured, so utterly unproductive in the conventional sense. Yet, as the boys laughed and chattered, he felt a strange sense of peace, an unfamiliar but welcome reprieve from the relentless pace of his usual life. "What do you think?" Nate asked, brushing sand off his hands as they stepped back to admire their creation. Owen tilted his head, examining the uneven towers and crooked walls. "It's good, but we need flags." "And shells," Caleb added, "to make it fancy." Nate chuckled. "All right, let's find some." The three of them spread out along the shoreline, their eyes scanning the sand for treasures. Caleb held up a smooth white shell, his face beaming with pride, while Owen darted between patches of wet sand, searching for something extraordinary. Nate trailed behind, his gaze flickering between the boys and the horizon. For years, he had chased the horizon metaphorically, always striving for the next big deal, the next monumental achievement. But watching Owen and Caleb now, he realized that the most meaningful things didn't lie in distant horizons or towering skyscrapers. They were right here, tangible and fleeting, like the shells scattered along the shore. When they returned to the castle, Emily was waiting, her sandals dangling from one hand as she stood barefoot on the sand. She watched them approach, her expression softening as the boys proudly displayed their collection of shells and rocks. "Look, Mom," Caleb said, holding up a particularly shiny stone. "We're going to decorate the castle." Emily knelt, her smile warm but tinged with emotion. "That's perfect, sweetheart. Let's see what you've made." The twins eagerly led her to the castle, explaining every detail as they placed the shells along its walls and stuck twigs into the sand as makeshift flags. Nate stood off to the side, watching them interact. Emily's ease with the boys was something he envied, a bond forged through years of shared moments he had missed. "You've got a knack for sandcastle construction," Emily said, glancing at him over her shoulder. Nate shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I've built my share of castles, just never in sand." Her laugh was soft, almost wistful. "I can see that." For a moment, they stood in silence, the sound of the waves and the boys' laughter filling the space between them. Finally, Nate spoke, his voice quieter. "Thank you for letting me spend time with them. I know I don't deserve it, but ungrateful. Emily's gaze lingered on him, her expression unreadable. They're good kids. They've been through a lot, but they're resilient. If you want to be in their lives, Nate, you need to show them you're here for the long haul, not just for today. I want that, he said firmly. More than anything. Emily nodded but didn't respond. She turned her attention back to the boys, who were now arguing over whose flag should go on the tallest tower. Nate let the moment settle, recognizing that words would only take him so far. The rest would be up to his actions. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting the beach in shades of amber and gold, the group made their way back to the villa. The boys ran ahead, their energy seemingly endless despite the long day. Emily and Nate walked in silence, the tension between them less sharp but still present. Finally, Nate spoke, his voice hesitant. "Why now?" he asked. "Why bring them here after all this time?" Emily sighed, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Because they started asking questions. About their dad. About why they didn't have one. I couldn't keep dodging them forever." He nodded, his throat tightening. "And you thought I'd be worth introducing them to?" "I wasn't sure," she admitted. "You've always been so driven, so focused on what you wanted. I didn't know if you'd even care about them." Her words cut deep, but Nate knew they weren't entirely unjustified. He had spent years prioritizing his ambitions over everything else. But now, standing on this beach with the woman he had once loved and the children he was only beginning to know, he felt a shift within himself, a realization that his priorities had been wrong for too long. "I care," he said, his voice firm. "I care more than I can put into words." Emily looked at him, her expression softening. "Then show them, Nate. Show them they can count on you." Back at the villa, the boys were sprawled on the floor, exhausted but happy as they played with a set of building blocks Nate had brought as a gift. Emily sat on the couch, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, while Nate leaned against the doorway, watching the scene unfold. "They're amazing," he said softly, his voice almost reverent. "They are," Emily agreed, a small smile playing on her lips. "They're my world." "I want to be part of that world," Nate said, his gaze steady. "I know I can't change the past, but I want to be there for them now. For all of you." Emily met his eyes, her expression cautious but not closed off. "It's not going to be easy, Nate. They don't know you yet, and trust, it takes time." "I'm willing to do whatever it takes," he said, his voice resolute. "I'll prove it to you. To them." Emily studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll see." It wasn't a promise, but it was enough. A small step forward in a journey that Nate knew would be long and challenging. As the boys began to nod off, their tiny hands clutching the building blocks, Nate felt a strange but welcome warmth settle in his chest. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about the next deal or the next skyscraper. He was thinking about tomorrow, about the life he might finally have a chance to build with the people who mattered most. Fractures in the empire. The following morning dawned with a muted light, the sky overcast, as though reflecting the unease that had settled over Nate's meticulously crafted world. The luxury of the island seemed untouched. Birds chirped from palm trees, waves kissed the golden sands, and staff moved quietly to prepare for another day catering to the elite guests. But for Nate, everything felt tenuous, as if one wrong step could cause the ground beneath him to crumble. He stood on the balcony of his private suite, his coffee untouched on the polished table beside him. From his vantage point, he could see the villa where Emily and the boys were staying. The twins had already emerged, chasing each other across the lawn, their laughter carrying faintly on the breeze. Watching them, Nate felt a strange blend of joy and regret, a yearning for the years he had missed, and an ache to ensure he wouldn't miss any more. The sound of his phone vibrating on the table snapped him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. It was Victoria. "Morning," he said, his tone clipped. "What's the update?" Victoria's voice came through steady and professional, though tinged with tension. "We've confirmed that the anonymous payments to Emily originated from a discretionary fund tied to your company." Nate frowned. "And who's behind it?" A pause. "Robert Langston," she said finally. "Your former CFO." The name sent a jolt through Nate. Robert had been one of his closest allies during the early days of his career, a man he trusted implicitly to handle the financial intricacies of his growing empire. But their relationship had soured years ago, when Nate discovered discrepancies in the company's accounts. Nothing egregious, but enough to warrant a parting of ways. Now, the revelation that Robert had been funneling money to Emily behind his back left Nate with a bitter taste in his mouth. "Robert," he repeated, his mind racing. "Why would he do that?" "I can't say for sure," Victoria admitted. "But it started shortly after Emily left New York. It's clear he's been supporting her financially all this time. And there's more. He's here, Nate. He checked into the resort last night under an alias." Nate's grip on the phone tightened. "He's here?" "Yes. I thought you'd want to know." "Where is he now?" Nate demanded, his voice sharp. "One of the private villas near the cliffs." "Do you want me to?" "I'll handle it," Nate interrupted, already heading for the door. "Keep this quiet." The path to the villa wound through a secluded part of the island, shaded by towering palm trees and dense greenery. Nate's pace was brisk, his jaw set in a hard line as he processed what he had just learned. Robert's betrayal wasn't just a professional affront, it was personal. The thought that someone so close to him had been meddling in his life, and Emily's, stoked a fire of anger deep within him. When he reached the villa, he didn't bother knocking. He pushed the door open, his entrance unannounced and forceful. Inside, Robert Langston sat on the terrace, a glass of wine in hand and a smug smile playing on his lips, as though he had been expecting this confrontation. "Nate," Robert greeted, his tone casual. "Always a pleasure." "Cut the crap, Robert," Nate snapped, stepping onto the terrace. "Why are you here, and why the hell have you been sending money to Emily?" Robert's smile didn't falter. He leaned back in his chair, swirling the wine in his glass. "I see Victoria's been doing her homework. Efficient, as always." "Answer the question," Nate demanded, his voice cold. Robert sighed, setting his glass down on the table. "Fine. You want the truth. I helped Emily because someone had to. You were too busy chasing your dreams to notice her slipping through the cracks. She came to you, didn't she? Pleaded for help, and you ignored her." Nate bristled, his hands curling into fists. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, don't I?" Robert shot back, his voice rising. "I watched you, Nate. Watched as you built your empire at the expense of everyone around you. Emily was just another casualty, wasn't she? Conveniently out of sight, out of mind." Nate stepped closer, his anger barely contained. "That doesn't give you the right to interfere in my life, or hers." Robert stood, his demeanor shifting from smug to confrontational. "I didn't interfere. I did what you should have done. I made sure she and the boys were taken care of when you couldn't be bothered. You're welcome, by the way." Nate's jaw tightened, the weight of Robert's words pressing down on him. Deep down, he couldn't shake the possibility that there was truth in them, that his obsession with success had blinded him to everything else. But he refused to let Robert turn this into a moral high ground. "This isn't about helping Emily," Nate said, his voice low and dangerous. "It's about you trying to undermine me. Why are you really here, Robert?" Robert's expression darkened, his tone taking on an edge. "Because I want to see your perfect little empire crumble. You cut me out, Nate. Tossed me aside like I was nothing. Well, guess what? I've been watching, waiting, and now I'm here to return the favor." Nate stared at him, the pieces clicking into place. This wasn't just about Emily or the twins. It was about revenge. Robert's twisted way of settling old scores. The realization only fueled Nate's determination. "Get off my island," he said, his voice cold and final. "You're done here." Robert smirked, picking up his glass and raising it in a mock toast. "We'll see about that." By the time Nate returned to the main resort, the sun was high in the sky, casting harsh shadows across the manicured grounds. He headed straight to the villa where Emily and the boys were staying, his mind still reeling from the confrontation with Robert. When he arrived, Emily was sitting on the patio, a book in her lap. She looked up as he approached, her brow furrowing at the tension in his posture. "What happened?" she asked. "Robert Langston," Nate said, his tone clipped. "He's here. He's been funding you, hasn't he?" Emily's expression shifted to one of cautious wariness. "He's been helping, yes, but only because I had no other choice. I didn't ask for his help. He offered it." Nate ran a hand through his hair, the frustration evident on his face. "You should have told me." "Told you?" Emily's voice rose, incredulous. "When, Nate? While you were busy ignoring me. While you were too consumed by your business to notice I was even gone." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, he had no response. She was right. He had been blind to her struggles, too caught up in his own ambitions to see the damage he had caused. "I'm sorry," he said finally, the words heavy but genuine. "For everything. I should have been there. For you. For them." Emily studied him, her expression softening but still guarded. "Apologies are a start, Nate, but if you want to be part of their lives, it's going to take more than words." "I know," he said, his voice steady, "and I'm ready to prove it." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Then, from inside the villa, the sound of the twins laughing broke the tension, a reminder of what mattered most. Nate took a deep breath, his resolve firm. He had spent years building an empire, but now he was ready to rebuild something far more important, the trust and love of the family he never knew he had. Shadows of betrayal. The evening sky over the island was painted in shades of deep orange and dusky purple, the sun sinking into the horizon like a reluctant goodbye. The resort hummed with activity, its guests blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. But within the walls of Nathaniel Reed's empire, the fractures widened, threatening to bring everything crashing down. Nate sat alone in his office, his elbows resting on the sleek glass desk, his head bowed as he stared at the documents spread before him. They were damning. A trail of emails, financial transactions, and memos that all led back to Robert Langston. It was no longer speculation. Robert had been quietly sabotaging Nate's business for years. He had leaked sensitive information to competitors, orchestrated delays in major projects, and funneled money out of discretionary funds, all while posing as a loyal ally. Victoria stood at the edge of the room, her posture stiff as she watched Nate wrestle with the betrayal. She had uncovered the last pieces of the puzzle just hours ago, and her usual calm professionalism was tinged with unease. "He's been planning this for a long time," she said softly. "It wasn't just about Emily. He wanted to dismantle everything you built." Nate exhaled sharply, his hands tightening into fists. "And I let him. I trusted him when I shouldn't have." Victoria hesitated before stepping closer. "You couldn't have known, Nate." Robert was careful. He covered his tracks well. Most of this wouldn't have come to light if he hadn't gotten cocky. Nate's gaze shifted to the photo of Owen and Caleb on his desk, a snapshot Emily had shared earlier that day. The boys were laughing, their faces lit with pure joy as they posed next to their sandcastle. The sight of them filled him with both warmth and resolve. He wasn't just fighting for his business anymore. He was fighting for them, for the future he wanted to build with his sons. "I need to deal with him," Nate said, his voice cold and decisive. "He's here on my island, using my resources to stab me in the back. That ends tonight." By the time Nate reached Robert's villa, night had fallen. The air was thick with the scent of salt and tropical flowers, but Nate barely noticed. His focus was razor sharp, his anger simmering just below the surface. The villa's lights were dim, the faint glow casting long shadows across the terrace. Nate pushed open the door without knocking, his presence commanding. Robert was seated at a small table, sipping a glass of scotch, as though he had been expecting Nate. "Well, well," Robert drawled, setting his glass down with deliberate nonchalance. "If it isn't the man of the hour, come to gloat or to grovel." Nate didn't respond immediately. He stepped closer, his towering figure casting a shadow over Robert. "Enough games, Robert. I know everything. The leaks, the sabotage, the money you funneled to Emily. It all stops now." Robert smirked, leaning back in his chair. "You sound so sure of yourself, Nate. But tell me, what exactly do you plan to do? Call the authorities? Drag me through the courts? You know as well as I do that would take years, and your precious empire would take a hit in the process." Nate's jaw tightened, his temper barely in check. "I built this empire from nothing. I won't let you tear it down." "That's the problem, Nate," Robert said, his voice rising. "You think you're untouchable, but you're not. You've built your empire on power and control, and it's only a matter of time before it collapses under its own weight." Nate leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you're the one to bring me down. You're nothing more than a bitter man clinging to a grudge." Robert's smirk faltered for the first time, replaced by a flash of anger. "I made you, Nate. I handled the deals you couldn't, cleaned up the messes you created. But when I became inconvenient, you tossed me aside like garbage. Well, guess what? Garbage has a way of piling up." For a moment, the room was thick with tension, the air charged with unspoken threats. Nate straightened, his expression calm but resolute. "You're off my island by tomorrow morning. If I ever see your face again, I'll make sure you regret it." Robert stood, his smirk returning as he raised his glass in a mock toast. "Good luck, Nate. You're going to need it." Nate turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing in the quiet villa. But as he stepped into the night, his mind churned with thoughts of what Robert might do next. The man was unpredictable, and Nate knew this wasn't over. Back at Emily's villa, the atmosphere was starkly different. The twins were sprawled on the floor, playing a game they had invented with a set of marbles. Emily sat nearby, her gaze distant as she sipped a cup of tea. When Nate knocked softly on the door, she looked up, her expression a mix of surprise and curiosity. "Come in," she said, setting her cup down. Nate stepped inside, his presence filling the room. The boys looked up, their faces lighting up with excitement. "Nate," Owen exclaimed, scrambling to his feet. "We were just playing. Want to join?" "Maybe later, buddy," Nate said with a small smile. "Can I talk to your mom for a minute?" The twins exchanged glances but nodded, retreating to their room with exaggerated whispers about grown-up talk. When the door clicked shut, Nate turned to Emily, his expression somber. "What happened?" she asked, her tone cautious. "Robert," he said simply. "He's been sabotaging me for years. He's here on the island, and I confronted him tonight." Emily's brow furrowed, concern flickering across her face. "What does he want?" "Revenge," Nate admitted, running a hand through his hair. "He blames me for everything that went wrong in his life. He's bitter, and he's dangerous." Emily hesitated, then crossed her arms. "And how does this affect the boys, Nate? If Robert is as vindictive as you say, how do I know he won't try to use them against you, or against us?" Nate stepped closer, his gaze steady. "I won't let that happen. I promise you, Emily. I'll protect them. Whatever it takes." Her eyes searched his, weighing the sincerity in his words. After a long moment, she nodded, though her expression remained guarded. "I hope you mean that, Nate, because if you let them down—" "I won't," he interrupted, his voice firm. "I won't let any of you down." Emily sighed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I want to believe you, Nate, but trust doesn't come easy, not after everything." "I'll earn it," he said quietly, "no matter how long it takes." As they stood in the quiet villa, the weight of their shared history and uncertain future hung heavy in the air. Nate knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He had fought for his empire, but now, he was fighting for something far more important, his family. And he wasn't going to lose. Foundations rebuilt. The final rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft glow over the island. The distant hum of waves meeting the shore created a soothing backdrop as Nate stood on the balcony of his suite. His hands gripped the railing tightly, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the dark waters met the fading light. He had spent years building his empire, brick by metaphorical brick, sacrificing relationships, love, and perhaps even his humanity in the process. But in the past 2 days, everything had changed. The world he had built now felt hollow, eclipsed by the weight of the truths that had emerged. Emily and the boys had cracked open a part of him he had long buried, one that valued connection over power, people over profits, and Robert's betrayal was a painful reminder of the cost of neglecting what truly mattered. A knock on the door broke his reverie. Turning, Nate called out, "Come in." The door opened to reveal Emily, her expression guarded but softer than before. She wore a loose sundress, her hair pulled into a casual braid that made her seem impossibly radiant against the backdrop of the night. "Can we talk?" she asked, stepping inside. "Of course," Nate replied, gesturing toward the seating area. She took a seat on the plush sofa, folding her hands in her lap. For a moment, she said nothing, her gaze distant. Nate sat across from her, waiting patiently, sensing that whatever she wanted to say carried weight. Finally, Emily broke the silence. The boys had a great day today. They couldn't stop talking about the sandcastle and how you helped them build it. Nate smiled faintly, his heart warming at the thought. "They're amazing kids, Emily. You've done an incredible job raising them." Her eyes flicked to him, uncertainty mingling with gratitude. "I did what I could, but it wasn't easy. There were times I didn't know how we'd make it. And I hated you for not being there." Nate's chest tightened, guilt clawing at him. "I can't change what happened. But I want to be here now. I want to be the father they deserve." Emily studied him, her expression unreadable. "Do you mean that, Nate? Because it's not just about showing up for a weekend and playing the hero. It's about being there for the scraped knees, the bad dreams, the hard questions they'll ask when they're older. It's about consistency, sacrifice. Are you ready for that?" Her words were a challenge, but they were also a lifeline. Nate nodded slowly, his voice steady. "I am. Whatever it takes, I'll prove it to you. And to them." Emily leaned back, letting out a soft sigh. "They've already started to care about you, Nate. I see it in the way they look at you, the way they talk about you when you're not around. Don't let them down." "I won't," he said firmly. "They're my sons, Emily. I want to be a part of their lives in every way I can." For a moment, the tension eased, and a tentative smile touched Emily's lips. "I hope you mean that." The next morning, Nate awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. The island was bathed in soft light, the air crisp and alive with the sounds of nature. Instead of heading to his office or checking in on business matters, he made his way to the villa where Emily and the boys were staying. When he arrived, Owen and Caleb were already outside, kicking a soccer ball back and forth on the lawn. Their laughter rang out, pure and unrestrained, and Nate couldn't help but smile. "Can I join?" he called out, approaching them. "Yeah," Owen shouted, running to fetch the ball. "But you're on my team, okay?" "Caleb cheats." "I do not," Caleb protested, crossing his arms. Nate chuckled, crouching to their level. "How about I referee? No cheating, just good, clean soccer." The boys agreed, and for the next hour, the three of them ran up and down the lawn, their shouts and laughter echoing in the warm morning air. Emily watched from the patio, a cup of coffee in her hands and a soft smile on her face. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope, a possibility that Nate might truly be the father her boys deserved. Later that afternoon, Nate gathered his team in the main conference room of the resort. Victoria stood by his side, her tablet in hand, as the senior members of his staff filed in, their expressions ranging from curious to concerned. Once everyone was seated, Nate spoke, his tone calm but firm. As some of you may know, there's been a breach of trust within this company. Robert Langston has been sabotaging our operations for years, leaking information and undermining our projects. Effective immediately, he is banned from all properties and operations under my name. I will personally ensure that he is held accountable for his actions. The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Nate continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. But this isn't just about Robert. It's about accountability. I built this company on the principles of trust and excellence, and somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that. From this moment forward, we're going back to the basics. No more shortcuts. No more compromises. Victoria nodded, her expression one of quiet pride. Nate's resolve was evident, and she could see that he wasn't just fighting for his business. He was fighting to rebuild himself. That evening, Nate joined Emily and the boys for dinner on the beach. A long table had been set up under the stars, the sound of the waves creating a serene backdrop. Owen and Caleb were full of energy, recounting their soccer match and their plans to explore more of the island. Emily watched Nate interact with them, her heart caught in a mix of emotions. He was trying, genuinely trying, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that he might succeed. As the boys drifted off to sleep in their chairs, Nate turned to Emily, his expression earnest. "Thank you for giving me this chance. I know I don't deserve it, but I won't waste it." Emily met his gaze, her eyes searching his. "I see that, Nate, and for the boys' sake, for all our sakes, I hope you mean it." "I do," he said, his voice steady. "This isn't just about them. It's about us too. I want to rebuild what we lost, Emily. I know it won't happen overnight, but I'm willing to work for it." Her breath hitched, a flicker of vulnerability crossing her face. "It's not going to be easy." "I know," he said softly. "But I'm not the man I was before. I've changed, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving that to you." For a moment, they sat in silence, the stars above them casting a gentle light. The walls between them weren't gone, but they were thinner now, the first steps toward something new and unshakable. As the night deepened, Nate felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. For the first time, he saw a future not defined by skyscrapers or bank accounts, but by love, family, and the connections that truly mattered. And he knew that this was the foundation worth fighting for.